My grief is good because it drives me to imitate Christ. Good grief. Good grief. Is grief good? Well, let's talk about that. In walks Joel, the minor prophet. Remember, we're in this series called, I call it Major on the Minor, and the reason we do is because we're talking about the minor prophets, not minor in their purpose, not minor in their message, just their books are short, so they're called minor prophets. All 12 of them are. Today, we look at Joel. Last week, we looked at Jonah. That was a whale of a story. And so today, we look at Joel. Joel and grief, and what does that look like? You understand, Joel is prophesying to the southern kingdom. That's Judah. There's a northern kingdom called Israel. Both of them is Israelites. Both of them are Israelites. And the message of Joel is the day of the Lord. And when you say the day of the Lord, don't get real excited, because when you say the day of the Lord, what you're talking about is judgment. The Joel is saying judgment day is coming, and he says it's immediate, it's imminent, and it's ultimate. It's immediate in that you're going to face a national calamity. You're going to be wiped out by a national calamity in your land. There's also going to be a hostile takeover that's going to come to you. And finally, ultimately, you're going to face a judgment of God one day. And that's Joel's message kind of in a nutshell, and he kind of breaks it out. And the message is very, very simple in Joel. This is what he says, just in a nutshell. Your rituals, your worship means absolutely nothing to God unless your heart is right with God. When you are fully devoted to God with your heart, fully devoted to Him, that's when your rituals, that's when your worship can mean something. Otherwise, you're just a contradiction, and you are far from God, and you're an offensive to God. Joel's message is simple. Real change comes from the inside out, not the outside in. Real rituals comes by the rending or the tearing or the breaking of your heart, not from your rituals that you put on to say, oh, look, I am holy because I came to church one of 52 Sundays. Careful. Be very, very careful where you tread. I'm curious, has anybody here ever endured a natural disaster? Ever walked through a natural disaster? The closest thing that I could, as I was thinking about this, the closest thing I could think of was when I was in 8th grade, our house burned. We lost our home. And I've got 6 brothers and sisters. My mom and dad made the wise decision to leave us at the home by ourselves, and they went away for the weekend on a business trip, Mom and Dad. I had an 18-year-old brother, a sister, a 17-year-old brother, and they were watching us. My younger brother, who we now call Smokey, he went into the closet with a candle because he had a nightmare, and he lit the candle and caught a flannel bathrobe on fire, and it burned the house completely. Total devastation. But it really wasn't total loss. There was no life that was lost, and we had insurance. But that's about the closest thing that I've ever experienced to total devastation. I've never experienced anything like the people of Hurricane Harvey, and are still experiencing, where they feel like the devastation is so great, I have no way to recover. I have no hope of recovery. That's total devastation. Now, Joel, when he brings this message of total devastation, it is not a popular message. I mean, why would it be? But even more so when he preached this, or when he spoke this, because see, Judah was thriving. Judah's economy was just exploding. Not only that, they were living under the best king that ever lived under since Solomon. His name was Joash. And things were great. And in walks Joel. And he said, you're going to experience complete devastation in your land. And it's a judgment from God. How many of you like bugs? Anybody here like bugs? There's one man in the room that loves bugs. His name is Josh Llewellyn. I have a picture of one of his bugs. Show his bug. That is a locust. That is a locust. Looks like a grasshopper, but it's a locust. And I had Tracy put together a little video. And watch the video of locusts, what they do. By the way, we took the sound out of this because it's just gross. That is not snow, those are locusts. Understand, a locust eats its body weight every day. Every day it eats its body weight. Every day. there were 480 million locusts that hit the land and devastated 460 square miles. Okay? Just to give you a picture of what that would look like if it came to McLennan County. McLennan County, for that number of locusts hitting McLennan County, which is 1,042 square miles, those locusts would eat through McLennan County in 2.5 days. The devastation would be so great that Walmart, Sam's, Brookshire's, H-E-B would not be able to help you recover. It would, everything, every vegetation, everything would be gone. You wouldn't have anything. There would be no sustaining life. It's over. It's done. All green is gone. Look like West Texas is what it would look like. It's just dirt in 2.5 days. And this is what Joel says. In chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, he says, the word of the Lord came to Joel, son of Pethuel. He said, hear this, you elders. Listen, all who live in the land. Has anything like this ever happened in your days or in the days of your ancestors? Tell it to your children, and let your children tell it to their children, and their children to the next generation. What the locust swarm have left, the great locusts have eaten. What the great locusts have left, the young locusts have eaten. What the young locusts have left, the locusts have eaten. Do you get the idea? The locusts ate it all. And he said, don't just tell, it's not going to be remembered just by your generation. It's going to be remembered by 4 generations. That is devastation. That's total devastation. It's not going to be forgotten anytime soon. And Joel follows that theme for 2.5 chapters. 2.5 chapters, he talks about this devastation and the judgment of God that's going to come. And what he says is that your religious practices mean absolutely nothing. What matters is your heart before God. That if your heart is not right before God, you cheapen your religious practices. You cheapen your rituals. And God is not impressed. You see, the people had a problem. They inherited a land that God gave them. And the land they inherited was occupied by people who were godless. They were pagan. And when the children of Israel, when God's children came into the land, they just began to incorporate the practices of the people that were already in the land. And so they mixed a little bit of their pagan gods with the true God. And they mixed a little bit of their pagan practices with their true practices. And suddenly you just have false worship. That's what you have, because if you mix just a little bit with the truth, it's a lie. It is not truth, and that's what they had done. And now they're at a place of problem, and Joel steps up and gives judgment from God. The prophecy that Joel gave to the people was one of not just destruction, but it was so complete and so devastating that it would impact their worship. Remember, in Judah, that is where Jerusalem is located, which means that's where the temple's located. Joel says, this is so severe, this is so great, that you will not even have anything to sacrifice and worship. Church, this is Old Covenant, okay? Which means if it's Old Covenant, then our worship in this place, if we were under Old Covenant, would look much different. Because in this room, you would be sitting, Joel Peoples would be sitting there, and next to him, he would have a goat or some other animal. And Joel, at the appropriate, and what's your name again? Yeah. He would come up, Joel would come up here at the appropriate time, and he would slit that animal's throat as sacrifice for his sin. And every one of you would do the same with the animal you brought, because it's Old Covenant. And thank God for Jesus Christ, who sacrificed himself once for all. We no longer live under Old Covenant. We live under New Covenant. That Jesus Christ did that once for all. And he said, this is so severe, you will not have anything to bring to sacrifice. It's gone. Meaning you're not going to be able to worship. And it will be remembered through 4 generations. Joel's prophecy also said the destruction would be so complete and so severe that it just impacted all of life. All of life, worship and everything. Listen to what he said in chapter 2, verses 12 through 13. He said, even now, declares the Lord, return to me with all of your heart, with fasting and weeping and mourning. Rend your heart or tear your heart, and not your garments, because that was the way you showed grief. You tore your garments. He said, tear your heart, not your garments. Return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in love, and he relents from sending calamity. You hear the language Joel used. He told the people to return to God with all of their hearts. Don't just tear your garments. Don't just go through your religious practices. Come to God with all of your heart, because God is much more interested in your heart than He is your worship. Much more interested in your heart. And the children of Israel had this terrible, terrible idea that because they were descendants of Abraham, God would welcome them. Because they were descendants of Abraham, if they just went through the religious practices, God would welcome them. It almost sounds like this. Because I'm a Baptist, and not just a Baptist, I'm a Southern Baptist. Because I'm a Southern Baptist, God's going to love me. God's going to accept me. Bad news, church. No, He's not. God is not going to ask you when you get to heaven, are you a Baptist? No, He's not going to ask you. You know what else He's not going to ask you? He's not going to ask you, were you baptized? Are you wet behind the ears? He's not going to ask you that. He's going to ask you, do you know my Son? Because He made the sacrifice once for all for you. Do you have a relationship with Him? Because if you don't, you ain't coming in. Pardon the English. That was good preaching. I thought there'd at least be more than one Joe Peoples amen there. Thank you, Joe. I appreciate it. Feel the affirmation. Hallelujah. I am. I got a lot more. Well, Joe continued his prophecy telling the people that if they would just fully return to God, God would relent. God would pour out His blessing. And basically, that is the book of Joel and Cliff Notes. That's the book of Joel and Cliff Notes. So, how would you respond if everything you'd worked for in your life, everything you had worked for in your life was wiped out like that? How would you respond? I know one way you would respond with despair. With despair. That would be your immediate response, would it not? Everything's gone. Despair would come in immediately. There's an article that was written by researchers Melissa Carney and Philip Levine. They're researchers at the Brookings Institution. The article is entitled, "The Real Impact of Economic Despair." Listen to what they said. Individual families that are facing economic despair have a greater likelihood that their children will drop out of high school even if they are performing well academically. Why? Because they feel they have no hope. That when you feel like there's no hope, you're done. And regardless if you're making A's in school or not, you'll drop out because now you're just in despair and you have no more drive. So you just give up. You just give up. Despair. How do we respond to despair? Two ways. Two ways we respond to despair. One is with apathy. Apathy says, I'm going to push this as far away from me as I can get it. I'm going to close myself off emotionally, mentally, spiritually. I'm just going to close myself off. I'm not going to deal with it. And apathy happens most often to us when it happens over there. They experience that, whew, boy, I'm glad that didn't happen here. Man, I feel bad for them, but I'm not going to do anything. I just kind of feel bad, and I'm just apathetic. I just kind of push it to the side, and I don't get emotionally attached to that. Not in any way. Just kind of turn a blind eye to it. Here's another way to respond. Joel describes it in chapter 1, verse 8 through 10. He says, mourn like a virgin in sackcloth, grieve for the betrothed of her youth. Grain offerings and drink offerings are cut off from the house of the Lord. The priests are in mourning. Those who minister before the Lord, the fields are ruined. The ground is dried up. The grain is destroyed. The new wine is dried up. The olive oil fails. Another way you respond is what he just described here, and that is lament. Not a word we use very often. Lament. Lament. Lament does basically three things. When you truly lament, when you're in a place of despair, you truly lament. One, it shows your authenticity. You just don't hide anymore. It shows your authenticity. You see, you just get honest with God about your despair and about the place that you're in. A good picture of that is in the book of Ruth. Naomi and Ruth were close, and Naomi leaves her country to go to Moab because there's a great famine. As she leaves and arrives in Moab, her husband dies. 10 years later, both her son-in-laws die, and now she's at a place of deep, deep despair. And this is what she says, chapter 1, verse 13 of Ruth. She said, it is more bitter for me than for you because the Lord's hand has turned against me. She goes on in verse 20, it says, don't call me Naomi, she told them. Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. Have you ever been a place in your life where it was so dark, you were so down, circumstances or whatever had hit you so hard that you didn't know where God was? That it was so dark you didn't see light, that it was so encompassing. And don't give me the Sunday school answer, oh, but God's always there. Yes, He is, but you don't see Him, and you don't feel Him, and you don't know He's there, and you're walking in the darkness thinking you're going to stumble into everything, and you don't know where God is. Have you ever been there? I have. It's a difficult place. And lament lets you become a place of authenticity, that you actually speak it. God, your hand seems to be against me. I don't know where you are. Just call my life bitter because I don't see you. It's messy. And it's difficult. Second thing lament does, and this is where it gets really good, it invites others in. It invites others in. You see, Ruth told Naomi, I'll follow you wherever. Naomi said, I'm going to leave. Ruth said, no, you're not. Wherever you go, I'm going. You're not leaving me. Do you realize you were designed to be in community? God never designed you to walk through despair, to walk through the trials of life, through the valleys of the shadow of death by yourself. God designed you to walk in community with other believers who will journey with you through the difficult times of life. It's not to be done in isolation. You're never to suffer despair alone. That's when the enemy moves in, because you're by yourself. You're never intended to be that way. You're intended to live in community, to invite others in. Pray you always do. But there's a third. There's a third. It draws you closer to God. It draws us closer to God. You see, lament, in the middle of our despair, it keeps us connected to God. And you begin to ask the question, when do you find yourself praying most to God? Think about that for a minute. Judah was in a place of great prosperity. Underneath a good king, everything was at peace. Everything was prospering. Their 401ks were full. Their bank accounts were full. There was plenty of food on the table. And they weren't worried about a thing. When do you most often pray to God? When life is like that? Or when you get a doctor's report that rocks your world? Or when you get a child that says, I never want to see you again, I'm not coming back? Or when you get a spouse that says, I'm leaving, I don't love you anymore? I mean, when do you wind up praying more often? When things are great or when it's difficult? Because I think when things are great, we kind of move God to the back burner. He's still there, He's just on the back burner. But when things are difficult, all of a sudden, we pull God to the front burner and we say, God, I need you now. And we begin to pray hard. I think we kind of do that. We begin to cry out to God. You realize your pain becomes a freeway to God, and lament drives you to the very heart of God. Lament drives you in the very heart of God, because you're finally being honest enough to recognize the state that you're truly in. You're in a state of despair. And you don't ignore it with apathy. You attack it with lament. And when you attack it with lament, you bring others in. Because you're created to be in community, you journey together with that, with others. One of the most tragic things I ever see is going to the hospital to somebody that's in the hospital and they're facing life or death and they're in the bed alone with no one in the room. It's tragic. It ought not ever be that way. You weren't designed to live that way. You were designed to live in community where someone is there by you, lifting you up through the difficult time. One of the real tragedies of the church today is that we've moved to a place of apathy rather than lament. Well, I'm sorry that happened to them, but don't pull me into it. It's too messy. I don't know what to say, Pastor. You don't have to say anything. You just need to be there. You just need to be there and hold their hand. You don't have to say anything. They know you're there. You're expressing great love because you're there. Because when we go through it by ourselves, that's when the enemy steps in and you give him a foothold to your life. That's when he steps in and the enemy begins to say, you are worthless. You are a failure. Or he says things like this: God does not love you, because if God loved you, you wouldn't be experiencing this. And that's a lie from the pit of hell. That's a lie. Church, we live in a broken world. And because we live in a broken world, you are going to be going through the valley of the shadow of death. Question is, are you going to go through it alone, or are you going to have lament and go through it with God and with others with you who will give you strength in the middle of the difficult time? Lament opens us up to God and allows us to be honest with our pain that we're experiencing, and that is what Joel is trying to tell the people, and that's what he's trying to tell Meadowbrook. Pray you're hearing it. Joel is speaking to a people who've undergone severe devastation. The locusts have wiped them out. Wiped them out. Everything in their lives are wiped out. They don't have anything even to bring to worship. And Joel looks at them and said, if you will turn your heart back to God, if you will worship Him with all of your heart. Remember, Jesus said it kind of this way. If you worship the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and not just with your rituals, worship, then guess what? He shows up in the most difficult of times. And listen to what Joel says. Chapter 2, verse 20, he says, then God, I will pour out my spirit on my people. Your sons and your daughters will prophesy. Your old men will dream dreams. Your young men will see visions. Even on my servants, both men and women, I will pour out my spirit in those days. I will show wonders in the heavens and on the earth, blood and fire and billows of smoke. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. And then verse 18 of chapter 3, in that day the mountains will drip new wine, and the hills will flow with milk, and the ravines of Judah will run with water, and the fountain will flow out of the Lord's house, and will water the valleys of Acacias. God will pour out His blessing. Out of lament, God brings restoration. God brings renewal. And God brings just restores. The beauty of Joel, he doesn't leave you at a place without having hope. He comes full circle to say, you have hope if you will not just stand there and go through your rituals of tearing your garments. If you will return your heart fully to God, you will have hope. So, which future would you prefer? Which one would you prefer? A hope in a future? Or despair and devastation? It's really not even a choice, is it? It truly is a heart issue. So the question of the day is, where is your heart? Where is your heart? With lament, it can be well with your soul. Let's pray together.